Hello, and welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Today I'm asking a pretty provocative question. Was Jesus a capitalist or a communist or a socialist? And the answer is honestly none of these, because even though economics is all over the Bible, and we'll talk about that a little bit, the modern labels which are modernist ideas that come out of the Enlightenment or come out of the post-Enlightenment modern period really just don't apply. And you can't really, it's not a good idea to take ancient texts and then mold them into modern labels. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use the Bible in order to comment or criticize modernist ideas. Of course, we do that all the time. I mean, that's the that's sort of the purpose of ministry. That's what I do in these podcasts. But it's really you have to be careful about taking modern ideas and then projecting them and saying that's what the ancients said. And people do this all the time. You see people projecting their ideas about capitalism and socialism and even communism on the ancient texts all the time. Now, the Bible has a lot to say about commerce. And it's really important that you read it that way, because it says a lot about fair measures and honest business practices. Certainly, there's all kinds of passages about fair trade and what that is. There's also a lot of discussion about commerce and buying and selling, and also, which is for individuals, of course, or individual families, but then also what is in the common good and how do you contribute to the common good. There's lots of condemnation for those who avoid doing things for the common good. And I'll talk about that a little bit too, things like Jubilee and tithing and so forth. And it does also unequivocally condemn cheating and repression. So that's how you can use the Bible and take these ancient practices, things like I mentioned, Jubilee, charity, tithing, selling goods and services. Those all happened in the Bible. And there's lots of good things from that ancient context that we can apply today. So, and understanding how they achieved balance between individual or family wealth and the common good of the society can really help us in understanding how we do that, because every society has to negotiate that, right? And some do it very well, and some do it very poorly. And the Bible has a lot to say about that. So, I'll get started with this by looking at a couple of examples. One is particularly the example of usury, which is the most widely disobeyed law, probably the most widely disobeyed law in the Bible. We don't think usury, we don't think charging interest and credit are bad things at all. But of course, in the Bible, usury, which is the excessive charging of interest, is strictly condemned, and I'll talk about that. But understanding how that was used then, and then how capital allocation, credit, and interest are used today is a really good measure of understanding how the ancient scriptures apply to us today, and what we can take from that, and how we renegotiate these ideas in every generation. So I'll talk about that in a little bit of detail, and then some economics around that. The other passage, and this is all from Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 23. Acts 2, however, shows a form of communism, if you want to think of it that way, in the little c way, or sharing of resources where there's no private ownership as an ideal. And this is in Acts 2:44 through 45. Also mention that a little bit too, and what was meant in that society for that time, and whether that applies to us or not. So when we look at Leviticus 25, let's talk about credit and economic systems. So Leviticus 25, 36 through 37 says, "Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God. Let them live with you. You shall not lend them your money at interest taken in advance or provide them food at a profit." Now, clearly, this means something to them, meant something to them. In Deuteronomy, we get a little bit of a clarification. Now, remember, Deuteronomy means second law, and what that really meant in that time was there was the ancient laws and then the reinterpretation by the Deuteronomists in order to kind of give more color and life to these laws, and that was tied with Moses going into the Promised Land, a reapplication of the law. And in Deuteronomy 23:19 through 20, this is what it says about usury. It says, "You shall not charge interest on loans to another Israelite." Interesting. Interest on money, interest on provisions, interest on anything that is lent. On loans to a foreigner, you may charge interest, but on loans to another Israelite, you may not charge interest, so that the Lord your God may bless you with all of your undertakings in the land that you are about to enter and possess. So you can see there's a little more color in this one compared to the Leviticus passage. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? We don't make those distinctions. In fact, there's kind of an ugly history about usury and about this was very anti-Semitic in Europe. For some reason, the Catholic Church and Christians thought that the laws applied to them and not to Jewish people, and used that against them. But what's really interesting here is just the difference in economic systems. Without credit, without loaning at interest, we wouldn't have our modern society. We wouldn't have anything like the wealth and well-being that we have. That this idea of commerce, and that how commerce is fueled with credit, and then how you can make money based on loaning, is just the centerpiece of modern capitalism. You need to have credit in order to be able to buy goods, to be able to produce them, and then turn them into products, and then have them in inventory, and then being able to sell them. That's just the basic thing. Now, of course, that happened in ancient times too. It's just that the investment involved was different, and that the credit was usually handled within family structures, within their tribes, within the Israelite tribes. But when you get to more complex societies, and you get to societies where people don't know each other, and that you do commerce by the exchange of money and not a barter system, you pretty much have to have a credit system in order to do that. And it turns out that what we've discovered in the thousands of years of doing this, especially since modern banking happened, starting in Italy in the 13th century or so, of course, in China, there was a similar thing, with paper money and credit that was associated with that happened. Well, guess what? You had this flourishing because you could move goods across things. You could give loans. You could exchange things for money, and you'd be able to do things. Then you had trade, and you had all of the good things that come from trade. The other thing that most people don't realize is that this system is far more efficient. The reason why people developed these systems of credit and using money and transfer and trade is because it's much more efficient in allocating capital, meaning knowing what to invest, when to invest it, what to charge, what the value is, and in understanding that value between buyer and seller, that's how you get this idea of allocating capital by the market. And, to us, that just seems so obvious. And like I said, in simpler societies, societies where you don't have a lot of capital intensive activities and manufacturing and things like that, well, you don't really have to think about it. But by the time we came to the 18th century, Adam Smith came around. Now, if I don't know if you know who Adam Smith is, but Adam Smith was the one who discovered in The Wealth of Nations, in his seminal book, basically described this complex interaction, more complex interaction of allocating capital. And the idea is, from that we get the idea of capitalism. So instead of it being dictated by people, that it's dictated by the market, by supply and demand. And of course, he describes that. So in a lot of respects, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith became sort of the Bible of modern capitalism. And it made a lot of sense because you were able to do that. Now, a lot of people in today's world, because we have hundreds of years of history, some of it very bad, because capitalism was also the driver of the slave trade, for example, is what caused Europeans to go around the world and subjugate people and to do colonialism and to do all of those things. Those were capitalist ideas and instincts that took people to do that. And quite simply, you wouldn't have been able to have Columbus, for example, or the people that went across the Atlantic. You wouldn't have the shipping that happened without credit and trade. So that's why capitalism became associated with bad things like that. And of course, we look at that today, and we see the abuses of capitalism all the time in our world as well. So how do you deal with this? Now, there's a couple ways you do. You can have Marx, for example, because when capitalism had caused an extreme level of wealth by the people who controlled the capital and had that and accumulated it, and the vast majority of people who weren't able to do that, they became subjugated. Now, of course, this happened through history. You've always had very wealthy people with all the resources, calling all the shots, and the vast majority of people basically being like serfs or slaves to them. As we became, and that has always happened, but capitalism, because it's far more efficient, just sent that into overdrive. And that's why you ended up with so many bad effects of capitalism. So one way to deal with that, of course, is with Karl Marx, is saying that, well, you have oppressors and you have victims and you have, the bourgeois and you had the proletariat and you had all those fancy terms with that, is that, well, then people will uprise and will oppose this, and they will use their collective power to push back on the really strong people. Again, something that's happened throughout history, but again, in modern systems, became much more efficient and much more fraught. In other words, the separation between the capital providers and the people and labor became wider, and it was only through major social action that they could rebel. And that's, and I'm greatly simplifying Marx. I don't really understand it in a very sophisticated way. But if you look at that sort of overview, you realize, oh, well, it's a reaction. It's a reaction to abuse, right? And So, we have looked at that as communism and state control or control of everything. And we've seen in the last century, a little more than a century, how that's as oppressive, if not, and usually more oppressive than uncontrolled capitalism, right? So, in the last 100 years or so, we developed these, what we call socialism, or these socialist tendencies of where we have collective things and we have collective control, usually with a government agent, government agencies that do this. So instead of controlling everything, they just control aspects of the economy and they redistribute wealth through socialist programs. So you can say, oh my goodness, this is very complicated. Does Jesus was obviously a communist, some people would say, because he wanted to distribute everything, right? Well, no, there's no evidence of that. The only thing that we have that's anything like what we would call communism or, extreme socialism, if you want to call it that, would be in Acts 22, 44 through 45. And this is where it says, all who believed were together and all had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and their goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. And this is that sort of idealistic community of the first Christian churches. So these first Christian churches, these first Christians had a radical idea of sharing, radical sharing. And that ideal has many merits to it. We see this in all kinds of contexts, even since that. So, you have the kibbutz system in Israel. You have other commune type things where people do share all their resources. There isn't private ownership. And that's essentially what we would call communism in the modern sense. That idea that as a commune, there isn't private ownership. Now, like I said, that does and it can work on small scales, and there are many examples of that. But even in those societies, you end up with abuses, right? Because people are people, right? And people, and they aren't particularly efficient, and they require an authoritarian to monitor it and make it work. Now, we might say, oh, well, no, these are good, these are perfect little societies. But the fact is that there's always an authoritarian. That authoritarian may be scripture in some cases, or a scripture or a writ of rules, but you have to have somebody who enforces it, right? You have to have elders or leaders that do that. There's always an authoritarian aspect to it. So you can say, okay, well, that's sort of the extreme. And that is in Scripture. There are a few places where that is. Most places in Scripture, actually, in their context, is probably something more that we're more familiar with. And that is something in between. People buying and selling, people trading. As throughout the Old Testament, Leviticus is filled with that, right? Filled with all kinds of rules about, your cattle and trading with your neighbor to get their goats and their wheat and all of that, and all the fair trade rules that go around that. They also talk about weights and measures. Weights and measures is a big deal in Scripture. And why is that so important? Well, unless you have buying and selling and trading, you don't need weights and measures, right? So you need fair weights and measures and being honest, having a culture of honesty, a culture of fairness in order for it to work. And like I said, Scripture is filled with that. Especially in the Old Testament, though, what you find is that there are certain things that are reserved. So that would be like the Levites. The Levites are the priestly class, and they were prohibited from owning land and, basically having too many of their own possessions. They were supported by the tithe. By all these tribes. And a lot of the fighting that you see between the tribes and the centralization of power that you see in the Old Testament comes from this tension between the taxed, the people who pay the tithe, and the tax takers and users, the Levites. And really beyond that, they it was deal making between the tribes and between the families. That was, and a very capitalistic way. People bargained with each other and they traded with each other, but a certain amount was reserved for the Levites, and that's what the tithe was. Then they discovered that over time, that they needed ways in order to rebuild equity, because certain families, certain tribes would become much more successful and start oppressing others. And this is where the idea of the Jubilee comes from. So the 50th year, this is Leviticus 25 as well, it says, the 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow nor reap the aftergrowth and harvest the unpruned vines, for it is jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat only of the field itself produces. In other words, in the 50th year, every 50 years, they had in their culture, they had this redistribution. Basically, they would free slaves. In the Jubilee year, they would basically stop investment in commercial activity, and then they would redistribute the land, and they would have this sort of re-leveling. Now, it was never fully equal. There were rich families and there were less rich families. There were leaders and there were, workers in the fields. They had slavery. The Israelites had slavery all along, and this was chattel slavery, and it is written explicitly about in the Old Testament. So you see where this, that they had a society that probably realistically was more what we're used to seeing. That is pretty, I would say uncontrolled or free trade and between people for the most part, but then some over structures above that. And that's just the way it was. Now, in the New Testament, it gets a bit more complicated, because in the New Testament, it was with Roman structures over them. So they had to live under Roman law, whereas in the Old Testament, it's a variety of different. Sometimes they were independent, and much of what we read is about Israelites having their own systems. But then there were significant periods in the Old Testament where they were under the either Assyrian rule, Babylonian rule, Egyptian rule, and they had to pay tributes to these, or they had to live under their legal systems, more or less. And how they integrated those into the scriptures is very interesting, and how they did that. So but when you get to the New Testament, that's where it gets a little bit different, because it kind of like in our own world, where a lot of these capitalist structures, a lot of these rules that we have are very much assumed, right? Because we live in highly structured societies today with, definite rules about the flow of capital and how we do business. Under Rome, they had that too. Now, of course, it's very different than what we have, but they had coinage, right? They had systems of borrowing and lending and paying interest and capital formation, doing big projects. They certainly had that in Rome. The Israelites, the people in Judea, especially, were pretty much under the thumb of the Romans. So you could say, well, they didn't have the kind of freedom that may have had in prior centuries, but, they operated in that system as well. So clearly they were buying and selling and trading and so forth. So you have people coming in, and Jesus is speaking in this environment, both with a long history of buying and selling and trading that was, they believed, ordained by God through Torah in the law, and then also being with the Romans and the kind of inequalities and difficulties that they had. I spoke in the last podcast about the fishing industry around the Sea of Galilee, and it's quite likely, it looks very likely, that Jesus' disciples mostly came from fishermen who were economically distressed by the Romans, who were overfishing the Sea of Galilee and controlling trade. And so when Jesus is talking about fairness, when Jesus is talking about economics, which he does quite a bit, he's always talking about it in that context, having this strong system over them with local rules, local trading, and with oppressed people that were just trying to make it, with all of the unfairness and difficulties that the system put on them. So, wow, doesn't that sound familiar? We have terrible cases of income inequality, unfairness in our own system, and we struggle against that system as well. And so that aspect of economics is very much like it was ancient times as it is today. If you're an oppressed person and you're being shoved down by rich people or by corporations or by governments or whatever, guess what? That was the people Jesus was talking to too. They were talking about governments taxing them hard, being taxed by the Romans, being taxed by the temple hierarchy. They were being pushed around quite a bit. If this discussion about the fishing industry, they were competing. They were competing with people who were stronger than them. It was difficult. There were people who were not being cared for. There were poor people. There were people with, orphans and widows, the lame. A lot of those people that Jesus was going around healing, they didn't have a social safety net. Their social safety net was either through charity, individual charity. There were resources from, probably from the temple and synagogues that supported them. But the Romans certainly didn't have any social safety nets. There was no social security for Romans, things like that. So whenever you're reading what Jesus is saying, and when you're reading in the first century context, you have to realize that the similarities to us come with this vast inequity between rich and poor. You really see it with Paul in especially 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians letters talk mostly about the inequity that people were retaining even after becoming Christians, and that they were not treating each other well. And wow, that really goes with us. So let's back out of that a little bit. Those are the similarities. What's different? Why don't socialism, communism, and capitalism, why don't they really apply to the ancient people so much? Well, part of it, like I mentioned, is the allocation of capital. Capitalism, one thing I do want to mention here is that I was a business person for a long time. I was in sales. I was in marketing. I have an MBA. I was never really in finance, but I dealt with a lot of finance people. But the idea is, one thing I really grew to appreciate, especially in manufacturing, because I also did a lot of manufacturing. I was really involved in that, in investment, capital investment in equipment, hiring people, all of that. You really you get a real appreciation for this idea that you need the free flow of capital. You need good credit, and you need good suppliers and good relationships with suppliers, good relationships with customers in order to make it all work and make it work efficiently. And it's really a wonderful thing when you see it up close. Any business person who has done this has seen that, wow, with goodwill, with fairness, with good relationships. Business can really uplift a lot of people, both suppliers, customers, and employees and managers. And when it's done well, if you're an employee in a company that really knows how to operate well, treats their employees well, I was thinking, we have examples of that in our own society. The great example is Costco. Costco has been uplifted as a great example where, employees are generally pretty happy. Of course, there are situations that individuals have problems with, but they're generally happy. They're generally well compensated. They have ways of affecting the organization. The organization is smart in how they treat them. And then there are organizations in our society where employees are treated horribly. There are many cases in our society whenever you deal with the poor, especially you deal with migrants, people who don't have legal status. Boy, wage theft is a big deal. If you don't deal with these people, you have no idea how much wage theft goes on, how many times employers cheat their employees, and how they do it brutally and terribly. And when you read about this in Scripture, you can really identify with that, is that these people, they didn't have the legal structures that we have. And even our legal structures are pretty weak about things like that. And especially if you're like a migrant, or you're afraid of your status, or you're afraid you're going to lose your job, or, we've had all this stuff in our society about that, right? Or you have the afraid of being harassed, like sexually harassed. I'm going to lose my job. Well, you need government. You need support from legal structures in order to be able to have some fairness in these situations. And we read lots of stories about that. So capitalism by itself, when it is done well, when it is not done with exploitation, when it is done with a degree of fairness, is a great thing because it is efficient. As soon as you get government involved, and there's sometimes you have to. So let's take a good example of that. It would be military, right? We need a military in order to protect us. We need police. We need all these government systems around us to certain degrees, and those are non-productive activities. So that the capital and the resources that are allocated to military, some people make a lot of money doing that. People like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all of those contractors, they make a lot of money doing this. But that's non-productive activity because your customer is the government, and it's not used to create wealth for other people. But we all agree that we have to allocate some capital inefficiently in order to support society. We have to have some level of redistribution of wealth, if you want to call it that, in order to have a society that works. And that was true in ancient times. Was not nearly as complex as it is for us. They didn't have things like income tax and things like that, but they certainly had things like tariffs, for example, and they certainly had things like other kinds of taxes. But they didn't have the same thing. But the motivation and the reasons are the same. There's giving people the freedom to allocate capital as they see fit and do the right things. And, there's self-interest. Remember, self-interest isn't bad. It's harmful self-interest that's bad. Self-interest is not sinful. Harmful self-interest where it hurts other people is sinful. And I think we can all agree with that. And it shouldn't be that hard then to understand that this idea of capitalism is a neutral thing. It's just that. When it becomes exploitative, when you don't have rules around it that take care of people and allow people to thrive in it, that's when it's wrong. That's when it's sinful. That's when it's evil. And the same thing goes with socialism. A certain amount of socialism is needed. I would call having a military, that's socialist. But also things like pensions, things like Social Security, healthcare, things like that, that the market doesn't do a good job of taking care of everybody. We have that problem in America, right? We have a market sort of socialist approach to medicine, and there are significant numbers of people that don't get good health care, or they get overcharged, or there's a misallocation of resources. That's the problem with since medicine isn't capitalist, and it can't be completely because you'd leave lots of people unserved. As a result, you end up with an inefficient system. So that's where that struggle comes from. Those complications of that, some of that bureaucracy and things like that, while they may have had some parallels in ancient societies, those societies just weren't as complex as ours. So as a result, the complexity, the chances for inefficiencies to arise in modern society, in bureaucracies, is greater. It just is. But you need things like water systems, sewers, streets, military. You need basic health care. You need things like a basic pension system, Social Security. If you didn't have that, we would be far poorer today. It's some of these social structures that people push back so hard against are what make us prosperous today. And because we can't do without them. Now, sometimes they're wasteful. Sometimes they need to be cut. Sometimes they need to be bolstered and reconfigured. That's just the messy thing that you do in society. So this is why when people take radical approaches and they say, well, Jesus is, a socialist. He's woke. He's going to take care. He doesn't believe in any capitalism. Is nonsense, because that's not true. It's not what he says. To say something on the other side, and many American conservatives do this, is that they say that, all charity needs to be private. They'll say that the government has to be cut back, as far as possible. The government's evil and all of that. Or they'll say things like, that Jesus was a capitalist. I mean, come on, it doesn't even really say that. No, it's the negotiation. Every society always negotiates between private self-interest and common good. Every society does that. So a lot of times when you see this pushback, especially, against any kind of socialist, or people will run around, this drives me nuts, is when people say, you're a Marxist. And they just use that term so, you liberals are Marxists. They use it so loosely and so stupidly, honestly. No, it's just that people who are in different political beliefs have different ideas about how we should allocate resources, how we should use government. That's all it is, really. And to say and to lump people into groups and just say, you are this or you are that, just doesn't make sense. It's basically taking an extremist view, or like a lot of people talk about, is when you make everything into a God issue. That black and white extremes. It just doesn't make sense, and that's what people do with these scriptures all the time. And why it's important that we need to kind of back away from that, and then also to talk about how people renegotiate this in every generation. And that is truly biblical, is that through the centuries, we saw this in the Old Testament. There's a reason why we have Deuteronomy, the second law. Deuteronomy means second law in Greek. The reason why we have this is that the rules were renegotiated from the time of the earlier laws of Exodus, and we believe they were renegotiated in Deuteronomy. Now, in biblical studies history, this probably really meant the time of the kings, the judges is the first law. The second law was probably more in Judea around the time of King Josiah, between King Hezekiah and King Josiah. That's what we probably see there. And, you're talking about hundreds of years in between these things. What did you have different? You had different political structures. 1 century, you might have the Assyrians that are knocking on your door. The next century, it might be the Babylonians who, ended up defeating the Assyrians, and now you have to negotiate with them. You have the Egyptians. The other thing that happened too is you have improvements in technology. Now, they happened a lot slower back then, but they certainly did. And by the time you get to the Roman period, which is 500, 600 years later, technology was vastly improved. Roman technology is fantastic compared to what they had before. They had things like aqueducts, and they had things like coins. They had real monetary systems. They had credit. They had major projects that you just couldn't accomplish hundreds of years before that, the Romans did, and they were very successful with that. So what did they do? They renegotiated the rules. And that's what we're doing, what we've done. So we have these laws about usury, which were a big problem for them, and they needed rules about how to accumulate capital. But they can't apply to us. We cannot have the benefits of modern society that we have with those kind of strict usury laws, right? We don't want exploitative interests. Of course, we have many examples of that today. Of course, payday loans and things like that, certainly. But to have the strict rules that we had in Scripture and then use them today, you just can't, because we have a system that needs something to do. So what do? We renegotiate that. That's why modern people don't think twice about these biblical rules about lending and about interest, and that we just don't think about it because it doesn't really apply to us. So we do that with Scripture constantly. We've done it with slavery. We have renegotiated how we read and how we use Scripture today, because we agree that slavery is evil and we shouldn't do it. We have done that about marriage. We believe in mutual consent in marriage. We believe in legal structures that protect women that they didn't have then. So what do? Do we say, well, the Scriptures don't matter or whatever? No, we just say we renegotiate how we use them. And the same thing happens, with sexuality and all kinds, it goes on and on and on. So it's how you use Scripture. I was talking with my son-in-law sometimes, who I talk about Bible stuff with, and I said the favorite thing I have about 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is God breathed, and people use that very badly, and as I did in another podcast, but right after it says, because it is useful for teaching, for reproof, and all of that. So what makes Scripture valuable in that verse is not that it's so much God breathed, it's that it's useful. It's that, yes, God, we believe that God, ordains these structures and fills us and breathes in the Spirit into what we do. But if that's all that happened, then then we would be stuck. We wouldn't have what we have today. We wouldn't be able to grow and change and build new things. So it's the usefulness of the law that matters. It's its utility. And that's true with all of these things. That's certainly true with economics. So one of the things I'd like to say to my parishioners too, especially in this time, We are in the midst of tremendous change, an unsettled period where, for, God knows why, but the Trump administration has decided that tariffs are a great idea. Almost every economist that you talk to think they're a horrible idea for the United States because all they're going to do is make us poorer, sicker, and stupider. But, for whatever reason, we're going through that period here. And we do this from time to time. We make these crazy decisions. Sometimes they pay off, sometimes they don't. Anyway, the thing to learn from this is that the basis for what we're doing, people are smart, they adjust, they change, they allocate capital, they do what they do. So if they are faithful and true and keep their feet on the ground and they're honest, because these systems require honesty. If they're generally honest and do the right things, they negotiate in good faith. They have win-win deals. When you do business well, everybody benefits. Society benefits. The person who works in the way, in the marginal job or the wage earner benefits if it's done well. And so that's what we should be talking about. And that's what Scripture talks about. It's not so much about, black and white systems. It's about the rules and the benefit that we can provide everyone. And that requires good faith negotiation. All business does. All government requires good faith negotiation. So when I look at what we're dealing with today, the thing that makes me sad is not so much that we need to change the system as much as that we're not negotiating in good faith. Our political leaders are so polarized right now that they don't even hardly talk to each other. We as citizens are hardly talking to each other. We do have some basic structures, but we, for whatever reason, have thought it's a good idea to not hold really, really wealthy people, billionaires, accountable like we should. We have thought for some reason that it's a good idea to not have the basic social structures for workers. We have thought that it's a good idea to make it so that the government does everything instead of creating incentives so that people will do the right thing and be honest with each other. Yeah, I mean, people are always going to try to game the system. Everybody does. People are always going to try to find their advantage, but we need to have rules such that we do this in a way that we all benefit, that society benefits. This is what you see when you look at Levitical law, when you look in the Old Testament. You see a people struggling to find a way to be equitable and that they can trade with each other and they can deal with each other in ways that benefit the society, where people win, where everyone benefits. And we've made major progress. I'd much, all of you, much rather live today than then. Much rather live today than 50 years ago or 100 years ago. We have greatly benefited from the free flow of capital, goods, people going across borders. We've benefited so much from that. And now, of course, and then you get reaction against that. So is Jesus a capitalist or a communist? He's neither. Did Jesus believe in fairness and commerce and common good? Absolutely. You look at his parables, in particular, like you look at the parable of the talents. Wow. Talk about fairness and difficulty. And, maybe I'll do this in another podcast, but the parable of the talents actually has a lot more to do about oppressed people than what we read about it from the surface. But he talks about these issues of fairness all the time, and it's economic fairness. And that's so that's why I think, so is Jesus a capitalist or a communist or a socialist? Doesn't matter. No, but Jesus was into fair trade and people working together peaceably in the peaceable kingdom. That's what we read about constantly, especially like in Isaiah 11. So I'll close with this. I'll say, a shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse. This is Isaiah 11:1. And a branch shall grow out of its roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, and spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. The peaceable kingdom, it comes out of this, and what we see in all the rules that we have there in the Jubilee year. So with that, I realize this is a complicated subject, and you can go a lot of different ways. But I think that if you stand back a little bit and think about your own life, think about what you've seen as good, fair practice, the things that you want for people and how they get along. When you've seen negotiations that go well, when you see people treating each other fairly, when you see people being lifted up in their station by, hard work and investing the right way and getting an education and all of that. I mean, thanks be to God for this. Thanks be to God for this. I've seen it so many times in my life when people who, with a little bit of help, a little bit of credit, a little bit of support, and a little education, make their lives and everyone around them so much better. And that's where where the gospel hits the road. So with this, I say, people say lots of things about the Bible, especially when it comes to economic systems that aren't really there. And they ignore the parts of the Bible that talk about economics a lot, and how we treat the poor and how we treat trade and how we do things a lot. And with that, I say, God bless you.